From Global Surgery's Johannesburg hub in South Africa, this presentation has specifically been recorded for the NIHR's Global Surgery Unit's training platform. I am Deirdre Kruger, Associate Professor of Surgical Research in the Department of Surgery at the University of the Witwatersrand. And the presentation is entitled The Literature Review. What should it accomplish? From Arlene Fink's book entitled Conducting Research Literature Reviews, I quote, "A literature review is a systematic, explicit, and reproducible method for identifying, evaluating, and interpreting the existing body of recorded work produced by researchers, scholars, and practitioners in a chosen field." Briefly, an outline of what I will be covering in this presentation. Firstly, what is a literature review and what should it accomplish? Where do I start? How do I write this daunting first draft? How do I then build on it? Some points to note with regard to citing while you're writing, and then questions to ask yourself to see whether you've achieved what you should in your literature review. And then briefly, we'll touch upon plagiarism. A literature review is like a dinner party, where you, as the writer, are a host, and the other writers or scholars are your guests. You are the one to decide whom you're going to invite to the dinner table and whom to omit. You're placing the name tags for your guests on particular seats, closer to you or further from you, depending on their relevance to your study. You are the one to choose how long you will have a chat with a particular guest and how much time you will devote to them. There's no wrong or right way of hosting. It's your dinner party, and only you decide about everything really. So in this example, my topic is towards a global movement of good. So really, even though I have guests at my table that may contradict my hypothesis and purely be there because they've been highly cited, I really want to narrow it down to specifically for this topic, including more humanitarians. So even by just reading the title and the abstract of an article, you can decide how relevant they are to your topic. And therefore, you already eliminate a lot of publications that are not relevant. The good versus the bad. A poor literature review will simply list and identify the sources. In essence, it will appear to be a glorified, annotated bibliography. A good literature review, on the other hand, will show signs of synthesis and understanding of the topic. There should be strong evidence of analytical thinking, as illustrated through the connections you make between the literature being reviewed. It's a document where you present your sources and their overall relationship to your thesis statement. What is a literature review? It surveys scholarly articles, books, reviews relevant to a particular issue, topic, area of research, or theory. It provides a description, summary, and critical evaluation of each work. It offers an overview of significant literature published on a topic and evaluated with regards to your research topic. Importantly, it is not a list of A said this, B said that. It is an evaluation of the literature, and I will show you examples shortly. But this evaluation of the literature should identify connections, contradictions, and ultimately gaps in the literature, hence providing you the opportunity for developing your own research. So what should a literature review for your research article or your research proposal accomplish? It should organize information and relate it to your research question. It should synthesize results into a summary of what is known in the existing body of knowledge and what is not. Again, importantly, you need to identify contradictions, inconsistencies, and gaps in the research, and identify and analyze controversy when it appears in the literature. It should help you develop your questions for further research, and it should draw conclusions based on your evaluation of the studies presented. So where do we start our literature review? Obviously, you will first select a research topic, again, of interest to you and narrow enough. Genuine interest is key. So you may or may not want to create a mind map, and it may or may not look as follows. But here are some tips for mind mapping. Just literally ask specific questions about what you would like to know about your topic. Who, how, which, what, when, why, where. Include absurd ideas. Don't correct. Don't censor. And just jot everything down as your first point of brainstorming. So if you're listening to this presentation, you probably already have a topic in mind. But here is an example, especially if you wish to guide a training surgeon into finding a topic for their master's level research. This paper was published in the South African Journal of Surgery by Dr. Alison Bentley. And in Table 1, it shows a nice elimination plan for surgical research topics, starting with the anatomical division. In this example, gastrointestinal was chosen, specifically the lower GIT, then the large intestine, and then from this the topic was further narrowed into inflammation of the large intestine, specifically ulcerative colitis. In Table 2, she gives examples of nice comparators to expand the research question. Are you comparing gender, male versus female, young versus the old, rural versus urban locations, the presence or absence of comorbidities, acute versus chronic disease states, or even severity of disease, or for example, stages of the cancer. Importantly, you need to choose a topic that is of genuine interest to you, that's narrow enough to be manageable, and then you need to read the literature. Background reading will no doubt help you choose and limit the scope of your project. Talk about your ideas with a colleague or your potential supervisor or collaborator. And if this is for degree purposes, be sure to get a supervisor on board. There are numerous ways of extracting information from the literature. You may use them unknowingly. You may use a combination of some of them, but this is just merely to point out that there are methods should you wish to go and see which one suits you best. The Cornell method uses a two-column approach with keywords and notes. Outline method is a structured way of note-taking. The mapping method, as we saw earlier, is a way of brainstorming. Charting method with chart structure and organized notes. And then just the sentence method with basic notes taking. So to give you a simple example of using a combination of the mapping or outline method to extract information from the literature, I will base my example on hypertension, which of course we know is a global risk factor for mortality and a major risk factor for cardiovascular disease. There are many avenues that have been researched and can still be researched with regard to hypertension, the measurement, symptoms of hypertension, causes or triggers, treatment of hypertension, and even the complications. But I decide I want to look at the causes of hypertension because I know that it is a multifactorial disorder involving interactions of genetic, environmental, demographic, and vascular factors. So specifically, I want to look at the genetic causes of hypertension because I know the underlying cause of high blood pressure is uncertain in the majority of patients with this disorder. But certainly, where there is an identifiable cause, such as in monogenic hypertension, we know that it almost always involves a restriction on the kidney's ability to excrete sodium. So now I'm further going to read the literature, and I see that actually it's abnormalities in the distal nephron that are pivotal in the development of hypertension. Specifically, the mutations in the genes coding for the final epithelium sodium channel occur in increased frequency in individuals with hypertension. And therefore, from the broader topic of hypertension, I've narrowed my topic down into investigating the abnormalities or mutations in the genes coding for the epithelium sodium channel. So now we have a topic. We've had this mind map of what literature we need to extract. And now, of course, you're going to search for articles, and there are various resources that we can use. Then we're going to select and read relevant studies and relevant information. And finally, you're going to write your first draft or your first outline of your literature review. So here are some electronic sources of information, to name but a few. Most of us would automatically first go to PubMed, and certainly in our institution we have great access to PubMed. How do your questions influence your search results, for example, in PubMed? So the broader the question, the higher the amount of articles that you will retrieve, but the lower the relevancy. As you narrow your question down, the fewer articles you will retrieve, but they will be directly relevant to your research question. For example, in PubMed, let's search for metastatic breast cancer. You'll see we get over 62,000 hits, the majority of which have been published in the most recent years. If we then further narrow our search to not only say metastatic breast cancer, but also specifically HER2 positive breast cancers, you'll see that we've gone from over 62,000 hits to just over 4,000. If we further narrow our search down to say metastatic breast cancer, HER2 positive breast cancer, specifically in Africa, you'll see we're now down to only 24 results, the majority of which have been in the last decade. So this is where we're going to start. We're going to look at the abstracts from these 24 manuscripts. So how do you evaluate the quality and scholarliness of a source? So obviously you are going to look at the authority. Who are the authors? Is this an institution that you've never heard of, or are these people who actually regularly research and publish on the topic? The currency of it, is it outdated? When was it published? Documentation. Is there evidence of scholarly research, and do they properly cite their sources? The intended audience, is it scholars and researchers? What is the objective or the purpose of this manuscript? And then the relevancy, is it actually relevant to your topic, which is really important question to ask. So again, when we write a publication, this is the order that we follow, or not necessarily the order of writing it, but this is the order of what our manuscript looks like. When we're reading a publication, this is the order that we read. And this is what we'll do with our 24 hits in PubMed. We will first look at the title and see if it is relevant and applicable to our topic. Then we'll read the abstract. If it is still of interest, because this is a major point of eliminating references in your literature review. If it's still of interest, you will then see, but what did the study aim to achieve? And if it's still relevant, then you'll read the introduction. And finally, you'll read the conclusion of the paper. And if all this really speaks to your topic, either for or against it, this is where you will read the full paper and include it in your literature review. So here are a few simple questions to ask yourself about these papers. Is the research message clear from the title? Do the authors come from a renowned institution, and what are their credentials? What is the hypothesis and the aim? Is the introduction then relevant and up to date? And then what are the conclusions, and how do they answer the aim of the study? This is very important. Also, when judging the scholarliness of an article, are the conclusions answering the aim set out in the manuscript? And then what is the study group size, the type, and the results? Writing the first draft. Draft an outline of what the review will cover and in what order, almost like my hypertension example above, using the outline method. Critically appraise the literature you wish to include in your literature review. Do the objectives of the particular studies match the conclusions? What was the study design? What were the strengths and limitations? Was the sample size adequate to power the study? What statistical analyses were used? Then you write a framework draft, which really tells the story, uses free writing, and you really write this first draft, this whole first draft down once. So let's tell the story again with a hypertension example and this upside down pyramid. Again, hypertension, leading global risk factor for mortality, major risk factor for cardiovascular and kidney disease. We know it's multifactorial, and the underlying cause is unknown in the majority of patients, but where there is an identifiable cause, such as in monogenic forms of hypertension, it almost always involves a restriction on the kidney's ability to excrete sodium. We know that there are genetic abnormalities in the distal nephron that play a pivotal role in the development of hypertension, specifically mutations in the genes encoding the epithelial sodium channel, more particularly in beta and gamma units of these genes. And finally, several studies on single nucleotide polymorphisms and haplotype analyses have been elucidated recently in the literature. So as you focus your storytelling, the content is the opposite. You will spend the least amount of time talking about hypertension as a whole. You will not go into detail of all the different factors, multifactorial interactions of all the genetic, environmental, demographic, all these factors that contribute to hypertension. You will spend almost no time on. As you increase the focus of your literature review, you will spend more content on what is more relevant to your specific topic. So usually our students will submit the first draft once it's written. And they have spent so much time writing this first daunting draft that they don't have the energy to go back and actually see, but have I critically appraised the literature? Have I looked at the claims that I've made, and does my evidence support the claim? Um, is there flow in my literature review? Is it telling a story? Um, so usually we receive first drafts that have literally just been written down once and not reread again. So which brings us to building on this first draft. Again, you are going to make claims of what you think in this draft. And you need to give reasons for why you think that. And of course, you need to provide the evidence in citing the literature. Importantly, you need to link your paragraphs and sentences with transitional words and phrases. And I'm going to give you an example. And I'm going to give you some nice transitional words and phrases to take with you. Importantly, building this first draft means you edit and revise, you analyze and critique, you check your grammar and your spelling, you check your citations versus your bibliography. Have your previous number 3 reference actually now become number 5? Is everything a mess? Is the Kruger et al. Paper really reference number 3 because in the bibliography it's actually listed as reference number 7? So these are things that you need to do when you build on the draft. Look at the transitional flow, again, using words and phrases to ensure that you're telling a story that flows well. So here is another example of how we tell a story in our literature review. And this is an introduction for a hypothetical study of a biomarker in vascular inflammation as published in Clinical Chemistry. And you can see this upside down pyramid again, or cone if you like. And you can compare the format of this introduction to the cone concept. You'll see again that the first sentence at the top of the cone tells the reader that the study relates to the broader topic of cardiovascular disease, which of course is an important health problem. Already the second sentence narrows the topic to chronic inflammation, which is linked to cardiovascular disease. And this is followed by a sentence that further focuses the topic to beta-selectin, a marker of inflammation that is increased in the serum of patients with peripheral vascular disease. The introduction next emphasizes that 2 major prospective studies have found a positive correlation between beta-selectin and actual cardiovascular risk. So the first paragraph has provided background information and known information from citable work, all the way demonstrating to the reader the importance of beta-selectin as a subject of research. The second paragraph, which is even narrower, and the narrower section of the cone, presents the unknown information, the knowledge gap that previous work has failed to address. Even without the question being explicitly stated, the reader can begin to deduce what the study question will be. And then the third paragraph, which is even closer to the tip of the cone, narrows the focus to the question itself and the purpose of the study. Is beta-selectin a contributing factor or just a marker of cardiovascular disease? At the minimum, there will be a yes-no answer. And then the last paragraph of this introduction gives the reader some clue as to how the study was performed. And of course, no method details are provided, no results and no conclusions, because this is the write-up of the current study. As promised, here are some transitional words and phrases that you can use in writing your literature review and ensure transitional flow. They are bold and they are so meaningful, and I just love them. And if you look at the blue ones, taken together, these findings suggest, these prior studies show that, using this information, or cumulatively, the aforementioned results support. So all these already tell you that without saying anything of what the body of current knowledge says, I'm saying that whatever I've said before, I am now summarizing what these prior studies have shown. If we look at the red one, it's telling you already, without saying anything of any results, that I'm going to give you the opposite of what I've just said. On the other hand, in contrast, conversely, and the green ones are, I'm going to give you more information that further is in addition, contributes to what I've already just said. Similarly, supporting the theory that, or likewise. So again, you're welcome to use these. They have been used over and over in the literature before. Every time I come across more that I love, I just add them. So be sure to use them, and I will also, again, as always, show you an example of where these words work so well. So importantly, write informative sections that flow well. If we look at the ABC of effective writing, it should be accurate, brief, and clear. Write one idea per sentence and one concept per paragraph. One idea per sentence and one concept per paragraph. Logically structure the paragraphs. The beginning and the end of a paragraph is most important. Connect these paragraphs by smooth transitions using the words and phrases provided above. Let's look at transitional flow, at how these phrases actually help us when we write our literature review. So, sepsis and the subsequent systemic inflammatory response syndrome represents a major cause of mortality and morbidity in the burn intensive care patients. Importantly, burn patients have a unique response to injury. Due to their extensive wounds, they are chronically exposed to inflammatory mediators, which alter their baseline metabolic profile. The current guidelines, so now you already know I'm giving you the most up-to-date guideline for diagnosing sepsis, are blah, blah, blah. This continuous exposure to inflammatory mediators in burn patients leads to significant alterations in the inflammatory markers used to identify infection, thereby rendering them poor biomarkers for sepsis in these patients. I'm telling you why the traditional markers are not good markers for sepsis in burns patients. Consequently, as a result, because of it being poor, it is difficult to identify infection in patients with extensive burns. So a consensus has been developed, and I give it here, may have no predictive value in burns, and it does not reflect the severity of the disease. So in addition to these guidelines, furthermore, the consensus describes clinical triggers that could identify the possible development of infection, such as specific temperature changes, etc., 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 as well as a clinical response to antibiotics. However, these can only be used after the initial period of 72 hours. So however already tells me I'm going to give you but there's bad news. However, it actually can't be used in the initial period. Another confounding factor, so another thing that is just adding insult to injury in identifying sepsis in burns patients, is that due to the chronic inflammatory response, the biomarkers which are routinely used, such as C-reactive protein, are elevated in the absence of infection, and therefore not reliable as diagnostic biomarkers for sepsis. So there, major problem. There we have it. Literature has been quoted, and now my next paragraph is introducing a new idea, and it starts with in recent years. So it's telling you that recently, in the last few years, this is what's happened. PCT has been identified as a marker with a strong potential for the diagnosis of bacterial infections, and there are my resources. I did not say reference 3 said this, reference 4 reported that. I've summarized the literature. All these studies support that PCT is identified as a potential marker. Under normal conditions, lovely start of a sentence. So what happens normally with PCT? Okay, it's a pro-hormone of calcitonin, and it is released by the C cells of the thyroid in response to hypercalcemia. Okay, but what happens in the presence of infection? This is what happens. It can increase up to 1,000-fold. So in a meta-analysis done by Simon, so why can Simon be singled out and described alone? Well, because the Simon meta-analysis is very important. The meta-analysis is the strongest evidence in our published literature because it summarizes the studies to date. So Simon can be discussed by itself. He showed that PCT was more sensitive and specific than CRP in identifying bacterial infection. Additionally, so what's more, in addition, increases in PCT in overt sepsis occur within a few hours. Okay, so we don't have to wait for the 72-hour period. So it's already showing us why it's potentially better than what we've described in the paragraphs above. And therefore, it's an attractive biomarker to assess PCT. However, okay, but there's also some bad news. It's also been found that these levels are increasing in other conditions. Therefore, it is questionable whether PCT is also a reliable marker for sepsis in burns patients. The most comprehensive study to date. That says to me the largest study, the best designed study, the most comprehensive study to date. What have they shown? They've shown that it's a good marker. Most recently, that says to me, this is the most recent work that's been published. Okay. Gabral's group reported that PCT stood out compared to other biomarkers. So again, cumulatively, the aforementioned results, or evidently, PCT is emerging as a biomarker. And our current study then aims to contribute in assessing this in our local patient population. So, cite while you write. I don't know. Does it seem like more hassle than what it's worth? No, absolutely not. I can't encourage you enough to get a citation manager. You download your citations into this reference manager as you use them in your draft. It really is, it can't be easier. From PubMed alone, you can just extract the citation into your reference manager. You then use it to cite as you write. Most of these speak to Word, and you can literally include references as you write in Microsoft Word. And then, of course, at the end, you compile your reference list after your final draft. And again, regardless of whether the journal that you're submitting to requires a Vancouver or a Harvard referencing method, you can chop and change if you've got an automatic reference manager. I have never come across a reference list that was 100% correct unless a reference manager was used. That's true, but also when you use one, there's still sometimes errors, but the errors are huge when a reference manager has not been used. So now you've written your literature review. How do you know that it is accomplishing what it should? You can ask yourself these questions. Does my introduction and literature review tell a story? Am I presenting a specific research question, not just summarizing the field? Who is my audience and is it relevant to them? Is the literature review appropriate to present my question? So has my search been broad enough to include all relevant studies, but has it also been narrow enough to exclude irrelevant studies? Have I excluded talking about all the multifactorial factors of hypertension? And have I actually focused it in actually just talking to the genetic factors of hypertension? Have I critically analyzed the studies? Have I cited and discussed studies that contradict my perspective? People often like to ignore them. They are important and they provide great discussion at the end of your manuscript. Is my literature review organized into useful, informative sections that flow well? Are all paragraphs logically structured? Are they connected by smooth transitions? And do they contain one idea or topic per paragraph? Or did I simply just cut and paste what somebody else has written? So we're not going to talk about plagiarism in detail. I just want to say that it's very important to know what is acceptable paraphrasing versus what is not. And this is very important when you write your literature review, as this is when you do often just, copy what their conclusion was because it's so well written. Unfortunately, you have to make it your own. Nowadays, we definitely put all our documents through plagiarism checkers to see that we are not unacceptably paraphrasing other people. But again, this is what a good literature review will show, is that you've put it in your own words. You've summarized the literature. You've not just said what A said and you've again repeated what B et al said. So just do note that plagiarism is considered a offense, and people are dismissed from their professional careers because of plagiarism, not only in South Africa, but the world over, deemed dismissed for plagiarism. Plagiarism costs also 5 papers in 5 different journals. So just be aware that when you do write your literature review, that you are writing it in your own words, and where you are paraphrasing, that it is acceptable paraphrasing. And remember that you can't use quotes throughout. So be sure to write in your own words. So finally, thank you for your attention. This is what we spoke about. Hopefully you have a better idea of what a literature review is about and what it should accomplish, where to start, writing that first draft, and importantly, not submitting it, but building on it and ensuring nice transitional flow. Cite while you write. It's always really much easier when you do use an automated referencing manager. Questions to ask yourself to know whether you've accomplished what you should in your literature review. And remember, acceptable paraphrasing versus plagiarism versus summarizing in your own words. Thank you so much. I hope this has been helpful. Keep well.